It begins with a whisper. Not from the wind, not from a neighbor, but from the floorboards beneath a rotting farmhouse on the edge of town. Some say the boards creak because of age, others because they remember. Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep. They say certain truths are better left unearthed. I've found one of those truths, and once I tell you, you'll wish you could put it back where it came from. In the late winter of 1956, in a small, unmarked town in the Appalachian Mountains, there lived a family that did not take kindly to outsiders. The locals rarely saw them in daylight, and when they did, it was always in pairs, walking side by side, faces down, avoiding eye contact. The children were thin but oddly bloated in the belly, their skin pale and blotchy, their hair a brittle straw yellow. And the women, well, their eyes carried the weight of something you couldn't name. Among them was a young woman named Elsie. She couldn't have been older than 19. She had a softness about her face, the kind that made you think of someone too sheltered, almost untouched by the outside world. But Elsie was carrying something inside her, and the whispers in town weren't about the baby itself. They were about the father. The official story, told in low voices over cracked coffee mugs at the diner, was that Elsie had met a man from another county, some drifter who had moved on before anyone could get a good look at him. But the unofficial story, the one that kept mothers pulling their children closer, was that the father was still in that farmhouse, sleeping under the same roof, sharing the same bloodline. If you drove past the property at night, you might see a dim yellow glow in the upstairs window, and sometimes the silhouette of two figures in that light, one taller, one smaller, à l'air, unmoving. People said they stood like that for hours, just staring out. Elsie's pregnancy wasn't marked with joy. It was met with silence. No baby shower, no neighbors bringing gifts, no doctor's visits. Just the slow, steady swelling of her belly as the seasons shifted, and the quiet dread that spread through the town like mold on old bread. Some people claimed they'd heard arguments in that house, not shouting, not violent, but something worse. A man's voice and a woman's voice, speaking low, with long pauses, as if deciding something they could never say aloud. And then, one day, Elsie vanished from public view entirely. When Elsie disappeared from sight, the town didn't ask questions. Not out loud, anyway. They knew better. Questions in that part of the world had a way of traveling faster than wind and landing in the wrong ears. Her absence was explained away with the simplest of lies. She's not feeling well. But no one saw her at the market. No one caught her drawing water from the well, and no one heard her voice carried on the night air. It was as though the walls of that farmhouse had swallowed her whole. The house itself had a kind of gravity. Even from the road, your eyes were drawn to it. The peeling white paint clinging to warped boards, the sagging roofline, the windows that seemed to stare back at you. There was an upstairs window with a torn curtain, and if you looked long enough, you might see it shift, as though someone had just moved behind it. Rumors deepened. Some whispered that Elsie's child wasn't growing right, that she was carrying something that should not be born. Others claimed that the baby's heartbeat could be heard from across the room, fast and irregular, like a frantic animal trapped in a cage. One old man, who lived half a mile away, swore he'd heard something in the dead of night. A sound like muffled crying, followed by a man's voice repeating, hush now, over and over, until silence fell again. By early spring, there were no signs of life from the farmhouse, except for thin curls of smoke from the chimney. The townsfolk didn't dare approach. Even the mailman left letters at the end of the driveway, tucked under a rock so the wind wouldn't carry them off. Then came the night of the storm. Rain hammered the tin roof, lightning split the hills, and thunder rolled through the valley like the voice of something old and angry. A neighbor said she saw a shadow in the yard, a hunched figure, barefoot, cradling something wrapped in cloth. It stood in the rain for nearly 10 minutes before retreating back into the house. The next morning, the storm had passed, but something lingered in the air. The smell. It wasn't the smell of rain-soaked earth or rotting leaves. It was sweet, cloying, and heavy. The kind of smell that told you something had died, and had been dead for some time. No one called the sheriff. No one spoke of it. But in the weeks that followed, they noticed something strange. The upstairs curtain, once torn and tattered, was gone, and the window was boarded up.
Months passed, and the story of Elsie and her brother was pushed into the shadows, where all ugly truths are eventually buried. But those who lived nearby still felt it, an unease that settled in their bones whenever they passed that stretch of road. By midsummer, the grass in the yard had grown high, swallowing the path to the door. The porch sagged further, and paint peeled in long, curling strips, as though the house itself was shedding skin. No visitors came or went, not even family, at least none anyone could see. A young boy named Caleb, curious beyond his years, claimed he had sneaked up to the side of the house one afternoon. He swore that through a small gap in the boarded window, he had seen Elsie, or what was left of her. Her skin, he said, was so pale it almost glowed in the dim light. Her hair hung in greasy ropes around her face, and she was holding something that moved. When he told his mother what he'd seen, she slapped him hard across the face and told him never to go near that place again. But Caleb noticed her eyes were wide, her lips trembling. She was scared. It was about this time that the strange noises began. At night, people living up to 2 miles away reported hearing cries, not quite human, not quite animal. They rose and fell like the wailing of something lost, and then would cut off abruptly, as if a hand had clamped down over its mouth. One night, a hunter passing through the woods behind the property said he saw a figure at the edge of the trees, small, shaking, watching him. When lightning lit the sky, he swore the eyes that stared back were not the eyes of a child. Too wide, too dark. And in that brief flash, he saw the thing's mouth twist into something that looked almost like a smile, but too many teeth showed. People stopped walking the road altogether. They'd take the long way around, even if it meant adding miles to their journey. No one wanted to be there when night fell. The real turning point came in late August. A traveling preacher stopped in town, staying at the small inn. The next morning, after visiting the house, he left without saying a word. But before he went, he told the innkeeper, "There are some things in this world that aren't God's work, and I've seen one of them in that house. By early autumn, the air itself seemed heavier around the property, as if the land was holding its breath. The few brave souls who ventured near claimed the smell was the worst part. It wasn't just the sour scent of rot, but something thicker, almost metallic, like the tang of blood hanging in damp air." One day, a man named Thomas Beale, who delivered supplies to the far edge of the county, found himself passing the house on a gray morning. Rain had been falling steadily for hours, and the yard was a swamp of mud and weeds. He swore he saw movement in the upper window, a flicker of a pale face, watching him intently. Something in him, stubbornness, or maybe sheer stupidity, made him stop his cart and call out. "Anyone there?" he shouted over the patter of rain. The figure disappeared. Then, slowly, the front door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was Elsie's brother. His clothes were soaked through, hanging off his thin frame, and his skin had the waxy look of someone who rarely saw daylight. He said nothing, just stared. Thomas, unsettled, tried to speak again, but that's when he noticed the sound, a soft, rhythmic noise coming from somewhere deeper in the house. At first he thought it was sobbing, but the longer he listened, the more it sounded, like chewing. Elsie's brother shifted slightly, enough for Thomas to see past him, just a sliver of the dimly lit hallway beyond. And in that sliver, a small figure crouched on the floor, hunched over something Thomas couldn't quite make out. It lifted its head for only a second, and Thomas swore he saw a mouth smeared with something dark. That was enough for him. Without another word, he turned and left,
forcing his cart forward through the rain. He didn't look back. Within days, whispers spread again through the town. Someone had heard Elsie screaming in the dead of night. Others swore they saw a shadowy fight.
You were moving through the yard, faster than any human should be able to run. The house, they said, was no longer just home to the two siblings. Something else lived there now. Something hungry. By winter, the surrounding woods had grown deathly quiet. The usual chorus of birds and rustling leaves was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt deliberate, as though even the animals understood to keep their distance. It was during this season that an old midwife named Ruth Halloway made her way to the property. Ruth had helped deliver nearly every child in the county for 40 years, and she claimed she had been summoned by a note left on her porch. The paper was damp, the handwriting shaky, but the message was clear. It's time. Come before the snow. Ruth arrived just before dusk, carrying her worn leather bag. She knocked once. The door opened, and there was Elsie, pale as the moon, belly swollen beneath a thin dress. Her eyes, dark and sunken, darted toward the woods before she wordlessly beckoned Ruth inside. The smell inside was unbearable. It was as if rot and sickness had seeped into the very walls. Ruth had seen poverty, disease, even the horrors of childbirth gone wrong. But this was something else. The shadows seemed alive here, curling along the floorboards like they were watching her. Elsie led her to a small room lit by a single oil lamp. On the bed lay a thin blanket, beneath which something shifted ever so slightly. "He's in here," Elsie whispered, though Ruth had no idea who she meant. Then Elsie placed a trembling hand on her own belly. Ruth tried to ask questions about the baby's father, about the state of the house. But Elsie's gaze just dropped to the floor. From somewhere down the hall, a low, wet breathing began, rhythmic and unnatural. It grew louder. Ruth realized then that they were not alone in the house. She glanced toward the doorway, and in the dim light she saw it. A tall figure, gaunt and twisted, with limbs that seemed too long for a human frame. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, watching them with a hunger too. Hat wasn't quite physical, and yet entirely was. The air grew cold enough to see her breath. Elsie's lips trembled. "It's the only way to keep us alive," she said. And from Ruth stumbled backward, her pulse hammering in her ears. That pale hand slipped back under the bed as quietly as it had emerged, like a snake retreating into its hole. The tall figure at the doorway didn't move. It only breathed, slow and steady, the sound rattling as though its lungs were full of water. Elsie turned her face toward Ruth, her eyes pleading. "You can't leave," she said. "Once you've been seen, you belong here." The words made no sense, but Ruth's instincts screamed that she had already stayed too long. She edged toward the lamp, hoping to grab it and run, but Elsie's voice stopped her cold. "It's his child," she whispered, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "And his father is my brother." The room swayed around Ruth as the truth sank in. This wasn't just a tragedy of poverty or isolation. This was something older, something festering through generations. The child inside Elsie was the product of a bloodline that had never left its own walls, that had folded inward on itself until it became something unrecognizable. The tall figure finally stepped forward. The light fell across its face, and Ruth saw features that were human in shape, but wrong in proportion. The jaw jutted forward at a grotesque angle. The eyes were sunken yet unblinking, and the skin was stretched taut over bones that seemed rearranged. Behind him, more shapes emerged from the shadows, not quite children, not quite adults. Their faces carried the unmistakable markers of deep inbreeding, asymmetrical features, slack jaws, and expressions that seemed permanently locked between hunger and confusion. Some clutched at the walls. One chewed on a strip of fabric as though it were meat. Ruth's throat went dry. She tried to form words, but the air in the room was thick, oppressive, almost as if breathing itself required permission. Elsie began humming, low in rhythm. Dick and the others, these malformed shadows of humanity, swayed with the sound. Then Ruth understood. The hum was a lullaby, but not for comfort. It was to keep them calm, to keep them from acting on whatever animal urge simmered behind their clouded eyes. And still, from under the bed, that same pale child's hand crept out again, this time not toward Ruth, but toward Elsie's leg. Ruth's body felt rooted to the spot, but her mind screamed at her to move. The pale hand slid up Elsie's calf, curling around it like a child seeking comfort, though the grip seemed far too strong. Elsie didn't flinch. She only smiled faintly, a smile that carried both resignation and devotion. The tall man moved closer to her, his gaze locked on Ruth. There was something almost ceremonial in his approach, as if this meeting had been anticipated, even rehearsed. His voice, when it came, was deep and steady. "She stays," he said. "She knows now. She's part of it." Ruth's throat tightened. Part of what? He tilted his head, and for a moment she saw the faintest flicker of pride in his misshapen face. "The blood," he whispered. "The same blood that's been here since the first stone was laid." The malformed figures in the shadows crept forward now, their bare feet dragging on the warped floorboards. Ruth noticed their eyes. Not just vacant, but watchful, as if they were waiting for a signal. Her pulse quickened when she realized some of them were carrying things: a length of rope, a heavy rusted chain, an iron hook. Elsie's humming grew louder, more insistent. The pale child under the bed let out a sound, not quite a cry, not quite a laugh, that froze Ruth's blood. She stepped back, her heel catching on a loose board. The noise it made echoed in the suffocating silence. That was all it took. The man lunged forward with shocking speed, his long fingers curling into claws. Ruth stumbled toward the door, but two of the others were already there, blocking the exit with blank, hungry stares. Every breath she took felt like it was pulling the walls closer, the ceiling lower. This wasn't a home. It was a tomb for the living, a prison for bloodlines that should have ended centuries ago. Elsie rose from the bed, one hand on her swollen belly, the other reaching out, toward Ruth. "It's better this way," she said softly. "The outside doesn't understand us. You will." Somewhere in the house, a door slammed shut. The humming stopped. And then, in the perfect, oppressive silence, Ruth realized there was no way out. Every story leaves a scar. Drop yours in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. Something is always listening.